Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the beginning of the Kirby Legacy. After doing videos on the original Kirby's Dream Land showcasing HAL's creative talents in bringing their new platformer franchise to life, in spite of missing the crucial gimmick that has defined the series as it stands now, we now move on to Kirby's Adventure, which was released shortly afterwards to capitalize on that game's success. Obviously, we aren't actually playing Kirby's Adventure, we're playing Nightmare in Dreamland, which was the zero-mission styled remake of Adventure, which included a multiplayer component and updates to graphics to make it more in line with the GBA platform. The original game was upgraded to a NES release from the Game Boy, which again made this game a great fit for this handheld, since a bunch of Nintendo's older franchise entries from that console were being ported and remade over to the GBA, since it was the perfect timing to reintroduce games like Metroid and Link to the Past to a new generation of fans. Nightmare in Dreamland started off almost exactly like the original game, where Kirby gets dropped off in Dreamland and has to go through a Green Greens-esque beginning as a pseudo-tutorial to get familiar again with how Kirby is supposed to work. Which works as a nod to the original game, a showing of the creative prowess and how HAL is reinventing the series using the same level essentially, and again as a crash course in introducing players to the core tenets of how the game is supposed to work now that it has new ideas. It's now time to talk about Kirby's consumption mechanic. In order to define itself later on as a franchise, instead of HAL doing a simple jumping and dodging based platformer, they decided to add eating as a combat mechanic. In order to deal with enemies, Kirby can eat them in order to kill or deal damage to them, and for most enemies, Kirby can gain a copy ability depending on which enemy he's eating, such as fire, lightning, or spinning attacks. Since HAL was putting its creative forces to good, the original game that introduced these abilities gave you quite a lot to work with that would stick with the Kirby series for the rest of time. On top of that, Kirby can also eat and spit out projectiles and blocks in order to dish out more damage if he doesn't have an ability to hand. It just acts as a last resource mechanic because the damage you're dealing is very infrequent and hard to get, so it really only comes into play during the game's many boss fights because otherwise there are many enemies on every level that you can take advantage of. In order to better support the copy ability, HAL also added in quite a lot of mini-bosses, which are unique enemies found in the middle of most levels that can be quickly dispatched and eaten for more special and powerful moves such as the iconic hammer attack, which is incredibly powerful and has a decent enough range to make it worthwhile. But in order to get access to it, you have to defeat Bonkers, which is a bit harder than the game's other Rogues Gallery members. Properly fleshed out and supported with tons of features and enemies to consume, the copy abilities would end up being the crux that would keep Kirby popular for years to come as other platformers fell into obscurity because their developers were not as inventive as HAL was back in the day. As you can see from the video footage, HAL's strengths on this game were on screen for all to see. The important thing about HAL that we'll see as the series develops later on is that they had the odd quirk as a studio of being able to marry this incredibly cutesy game of lovable Kirby going through a candy-coated world of niceness with the greatly paced challenges and a bit of cosmic horror on the side sometimes to really make it shine. And through that, we really do get a series that can look like this, but still be enjoyed by all audiences. We mentioned this in the Dreamland video that HAL was working with a limited monochromatic console back in those days, and even with the limitations of that system, their games still looked fantastic and were filled with interesting levels, making for a crazy solid platformer. And in spite of being an incredibly short 35-minute game, it still somehow felt like a full experience because of the dynamic world that you were going through. But now that they've moved on to hardier and future consoles, their design chops are even more profound and impressive. In order to focus on the new eating abilities and marry the themes of the game to the actual gameplay, Dreamland has been transformed into an entirely food-related place, with each world of the game labeled after some sort of food. Of course, as the series progressed, HAL handled this mechanic and the developing themes professionally, and decided to mix in a lot of fruits and vegetables into Kirby's diet, because if it was all just ice cream and cookies, moms would have complained about it. So I really do want to thank HAL for being so forward-thinking to actually dodge that entirely stupid controversy that could have happened. But on the other hand, even though they did that, the levels in this game are still fantastic. They're colorful, well-paced, and really full of interesting gameplay sections that end up taking full advantage of Kirby's ability to fly through the levels and his new combat mechanics. The level design of this game is wonderful, and it really took full advantage of the NES back in the day and the GBA now, the hardware's capabilities to end up creating these colorful backdrops that they were alluding to in Kirby's Dream Land. The whole thing is an incredibly solid NES platform brought up to 5th gen specs, and it really looks very interesting on screen. You really do want to explore these worlds because they were so well crafted and creatively planned. A nice addition to the game, since this was a console release originally, is that HAL decided to add bonus games which can be unlocked throughout the game to do something a bit different than just regular platforming. Overall, they are just cute distractions to the main game, but what they do provide the player with is points, so the minigames really only exist for their own challenge, their own sake, because they wanted to show something that was a bit more interesting and could be tied in really well with the normal gameplay to make something that's just a little bit of a break from the game that you're already playing. But, on the other hand, the iconic Slingshot bonus game does have an actual purpose where you can get on that screen to get extra lives for the rest of the game, which is pretty nice, since some of the later sections can actually be a bit difficult, and if you don't build yourself up to that point, then things could get a bit unfun for you. Plus, on the other hand, there really is something super satisfying about hitting the highest tier on that game and getting to see the exciting version of the Kirby dance awarding you for your greatness, and just getting to hear the noises of collecting all the lives that you get for being awesome at the game. This part of the game ended up being so well planned and executed that this would actually become a part of Kirby games for almost the rest of the franchise, like the boss fights that you do and the Kirby dance itself, which has only improved since its debut years ago. Something that unfortunately has not been fixed, and I'm surprised that this really did not get into a GBA remake, but the story of this game is completely non-existent. You can infer it well enough, just like any other Mario game, from the final battles and the journey that Kirby goes on, but frankly, during the remake process, not putting in an intro cutscene or some sort of CG pictures to explain what's happening is really bizarre, since the GBA could clearly handle doing something like that. Essentially, DDD is again up to no good, and for reasons, he decided to break apart the Dream Rod found in the Fountain of Dreams so that no one in Dreamland can have good dreams, and it caused Nightmare to rise as the cosmic threat to the residents of Dreamland. Now Kirby has to go on this galactic adventure to collect the pieces of the rod, slap them all together, and use it to knock DDD upside the head and banish Nightmare from Dreamland using its power. Most Kirby plots that we'll see in the later games will revolve around stuff essentially like this. Bad people coming down from space to invade Dreamland so that Kirby can't have a nice day of naps and snacks, so he has to go on all these adventures to stop their evil schemes to prevent him from having his relaxing Sundays. DDD is still the villain of the series at this point in the franchise, which would quickly stop being the case since he would start transitioning over to one of Kirby's allies in the later series, and only really becoming the villain later on due to corruption from the final villain, so that we could still hear that sweet, sweet DDD boss fight music, never changing from its original incarnation, only really being slightly improved and updated so that it can work on modern sound cards. And that's essentially the entire game in a nutshell. From an early Game Boy tech demo to being launched onto the NES to later being remade on the GBA, alongside Link to the Past and Super Mario World, Kirby was finally starting his journey to becoming the Nintendo mascot that we all know and love today, with HAL finally being able to fully realize their development talents in making one incredibly solid platformer. It finally brings us the fleshed out copyability mechanic that has defined Kirby as a series and shown us how fun it is to use in combat, and being able to just run around with it and experiencing all these different powers and abilities that they bothered to code into the game. Because they invested heavily in it right at the start, giving us a ton of different abilities to collect and experiment with. Kind of like what the Mario series would later on after the new Super Mario Bros. Series, but in this one we get basically all 15 copy abilities, the base ones, right away, which is just an incredible lot of fun. You get to learn, you get to use them, to experience the joy of finding which one is actually your favorite one, the experimentation, especially since some of them are actually pretty rare to get, which means that you have to fight the mini bosses and get super satisfied when you see them again, because you know that you get to get your favorite copy abilities and just blitz through the rest of the game, especially since the levels are well planned, they're fun to traverse, they're full of challenges, they're properly paced for actually being a competent difficulty curve, which, you know, not every platformer gets right. The soundtrack is great as a part of the backdrop to this game. Again, the artistry of HAL is just brilliant. Ultimately, Dreamland proves that Kirby had potential before, and Adventure showed us how they can make a full game out of it, and the proper game, the game to really spike off his career, when put onto the right hardware and handled by the right team. HAL Labs in this case had made another big splash onto the Nintendo consoles, and I really am looking forward to what they'll do next with the Kirby games, given how good of a position they already put him in with Adventure, now that it was polished into Nightmare in Dreamland. So without further ado, for our spacefaring hero, I will put up his final scoreboard for this fantastic game, and wish you all out there a victory for gamers. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around next time for some more spacefaring action.